Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. This is Parashath. Oh wow, that peace plan thing came out this week, and for many of us, we're so excited. We're finally going to have peace. They're going to implement the plan, and then we're going to have peace, and it's going to change things. And it doesn't really matter, but at least there's some progress Torah-wise available in bookstores after Purim, estive stores, and usual chains where you find it. It's going to be, God willing, we'll find distributors in America this coming week, and we'll also tell you where you can pick up your copies. Those of you copies, please tell me. We had a major mailing problem here in Kochav Yaakov. Basically, they wouldn't let me send outgoing mail. And that was kind of weird. But I hope that you got it, and there's still some of you here in Israel who I haven't even mailed it. The envelopes are sitting there. Today, I actually had a little confrontation with the mail people. Why it is that they're not allowing anybody here to send outgoing mail for an open post office when I was walking through Jerusalem today, also attempting to mail the last two of them. But if you've managed to receive your Haggadot, please tell me. Those of you in America who are waiting, they're going to be mailed either Wednesday or Thursday, a week from today. And you should be getting them soon. And so just sit tight, and thank you for your patience and for your support. Let's begin at the beginning, shall we? This week's Parashah is Bo, and I thought that it's especially makes the Haggadah especially relevant. The Chief Rabbi himself sent me a letter, which is the first, basically the first material in the Haggadah itself, whereas he reiterates his position. Don't forget, the Chief Rabbinate is very much in favor of maintaining the status quo. The Chief Rabbinate has been officially opposed to, for example, ascending the Temple Mount, Kal V'chomer, doing anything on the Temple Mount. That is very much the Chief Rabbinate's position now for almost a century. And the Chief Rabbi himself wrote about how, although he does not believe that it's going to be happening anytime soon, or that it's something that's practical-wise that we should be preparing for the sacrificial service. My Haggadah assumes that the sacrifice will go according to as planned, and the only question is, what are we going to do at the Seder once the sacrifice is sitting there? For all the other sacrificial services that could and should and will, God willing, take eat, for example, if the Thanksgiving offering, set texts or any other mitzvahs that they have to do, they don't have to make specific blessings on the bread. They don't have to eat the meat with bitter herbs. They don't have to drink the 4 cups of wine. They don't have to do anything. They just may have to make sure to say a bracha beforehand and a bracha afterwards, like any other meal. So this Haggadah is necessary. So he basically emphasized this point. But there's also some technical issues, and there's social issues, political issues. I don't want to get into political issues. I just want to talk about the halachic things. This isn't something that we could just do today and rebuild the temple and start the sacrifices, or even, as some are really chepping, if I may speak a little Yiddish, to do. Rabbi Ariel at the Temple Institute and others are really convinced that all it takes is to put a makeshift altar at the place of the altar and perform the commandments there. And that's not so clear. I'd just like to point out some things that have to be figured out before we do that. Some halacha that has to be decided. For example, we have Kohanim. They're to challenge people and say that the people who claim to be Kohanim, we know to be Kohanim, perhaps need to somehow prove their priesthood to an even greater extent, is wrong. If you call that into question, if you call their pedigrees, their lineage into question, you are also calling the entire Jewish peoples into question. You can't do a thing like that. We know who they are. But they have to be dressed properly. They have to be wearing the priestly vestments, and those are far from complete. The Temple Institute does create and has created priestly vestments, and they even have celebrity Kohanim who have tried on their own personal vestments. For example, skin. And Rabbi Nachman and Kahana, I remember years ago, were shown being fitted for their own priestly vestments and making the ones that are made out of linen. Turns out the cap they're meant to wear and the coverall robe and basically the short pants that they wear are made out of white linen, but they also have to be wearing the ceremonial sash, the belt, the avnate, and that is made of colored wool. It needs to be made of at least 3 types of colored wool: the techeleth, argaman, and tolath shani. And people are excited now. They're pretty convinced they have discovered the techeleth, and indeed, it seems to be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt now that the techeleth that Sog was on the way to discovering is the techeleth that is meant, at least for the tzitzith. Rabbi Rabinovich clarified something that seems from the Maimonides' rulings that perhaps real techeleth is not needed to use in the temple, but he pointed out that you could perhaps say that, but then there's so much overwhelming Talmudic sources and also the testimony of Maimonides' own son, who said, no, the real techeleth is what's meant to be used in the priestly vestments. So we have the techeleth, but the problem is that the argaman, the purple, which is always connected in the Torah to the techeleth, that's far from settled. Rav Herzog, when he began this mission to discover what the real techeleth is, he was working on the assumption that the argaman is the Tyrian purple, which the Phoenicians, that's the Canaanim who lived in places like Sidon and Tyre in ancient times. They were the main producers of these types of wool. So they were making the purple that we know as argaman, and he assumed that they were the same ones who were making the techeleth and using similar, perhaps even identical sources, similar processes to make this in identical sources, and that's what led him to discover the techeleth. So his assumption was argaman is a very closely related material, and indeed, chemically speaking, his hydrocarbon, and one of them has a bromine atom attached to the. Oh, I heard. I just saw that we're connection's unstable. Sorry about that. Techeleth and argaman, by Rav Herzog's conclusions, are very closely related molecules. As a matter of fact, you can have a sample which is half techeleth and half argaman. Half the molecules have been brominated and half have not. But the problem is that Maimonides himself, the Rambam, we rely on his rulings and his traditions to make these assumptions that we could, for example, rebuild the temple in preparation, and that it would, for example, be technically permitted for some in a certain state of purity to ascend the Temple Mount, and we rely on him for this. Rambam himself said that argaman is not, for example, from the Murex trunculus or any sea mollusk or any sea creature. He translates this in his commentary. He calls it the laka, and the lak nowadays in Hebrew, lak means nail polish, because it's this red, hard, shiny stuff you could paint onto your skin or onto your nails. That's the Arabic for derivative from a type of worm or a type of bug, just like the tolath shani is an even redder compound that comes from a type of worm. So we have to resolve this. We need to be on board with the fact that we're convinced that the techeleth is the techeleth, but also we need the argaman. Before you could even have a priest wearing, before you could even have a priest serving, you have to make sure he's wearing a proper avnate composed of these at least 3 types of wool: the purple wool with argaman, the blue wool from techeleth, and the red wool from tolath shani. Without that, there's nothing we could begin. This is one that Rav Schechter's pointed out. The tzitz is the golden small crown that the high priest would wear. The high priest wore a turban, a large turban, and he also wore this crown that sat on his forehead. It wasn't a full crown, a piece of gold that had the engraving Kodesh Lashem, holy to the Lord, and it was tied to his forehead with a string of, once again, techeleth. And it says that when we offer the sacrifices while the majority are in a state of ritual impurity from contact with the dead, which is basically our situation now, this is the dispensation that would allow us at least to remove certain forms of impurity by going to a mikvah. but the forms of impurity that have to be removed by sprinkling the ashes of the red cow, etc., that is overridden in cases of public need and when the majority are contaminated thereof. So this is something that would allow us, let's say, in years past, would have allowed us to offer the Korban Pesach, even if everybody were completely contaminated because we did not prepare the ashes of the red cow beforehand. It says that the tzitz miratzeh, the tzitz allows the Korban to be accepted. So what does that mean? The fact that the tzitz exists, it seems that it means when the high priest is wearing his vestments and counts as a high priest. Remember, he's not fully considered a high priest until he's actually dressed as a high priest. And even at night, when he goes home and he's dressed in his ordinary clothes, he has a certain lack of holiness, just like any other priest. When he is not wearing the priestly vestments, doesn't really count as an officiating priest. It seems that the priest has to be wearing the tzitz, the diadem. I wrote that, and that's how I'd write it. He has to be wearing it in his capacity as high priest in order for any other priest or himself to be conducting a service in a state of ritual contamination. And we wouldn't have that. Previous Passovers, if we had wanted to bring the Korban Pesach, we would have needed to have a high priest present, fully, technically speaking, a Sanhedrin, a duly formed Sanhedrin, could. We're being disconnected. Okay, if anybody could, sorry about that, we got disconnected for a second. A proper Sanhedrin can actually decide on matters of halacha. When it comes to identification of things, these questions can have to be resolved historically. They can't just say, well, tchelis is whatever we want it to be. Is it the tchelis or not? It's a question of fact. So too, we need to know the argaman. We need the tzitz. We need a Kohen Gadol fully dressed. The Kohen Gadol has a number of required vestments beyond that of the standard priest, of an ordinary priest. He has to wear, for example, the breastplate. And that had 12 precious stones on it, 12 expressly defined precious stones. And if you've opened up any good translation, you have seen that there is absolutely no consensus and practically no way short of finding a prophet to tell you what those 12 stones are. And those are basically a critical component of the priestly vestments. And before we would have them, we could not do anything whatsoever. And lastly, another identification problem, just off the top of my head, is the spices of the Ketoreth. Just a good example, you find that Maimonides tried his best to describe in Arabic what all the different spices were, which, by the way, there's very little consensus. There's a Hebrew word, kinnamon, with a dot in the nun, and spelled a kuf. And that was transliterated as kinnamon into Latin and Greek and other languages. It's basically the forerunner of our modern English word cinnamon. We just started pronouncing the C like an S, but it used to be pronounced more like a kuf. And that seems pretty clear that this spice, for example, is meant to be what you and I know as cinnamon, except the problem is Maimonides says it's not. And he calls what we call the kilofa, another one on the list, that's what we know as cinnamon, and the kilofa is something else entirely. And the incense, once again, is a required part of the service. Every day, they would offer the incense once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and a special offering of incense on Yom Kippur. And we need consensus. We need to come to a clear conclusion and definition and identification of what these things were before we can even dream of having a temple service, even without the temple. There's another problem. We need to conduct the sacrifices, the public sacrifices, the Timidim and Musafim, not the Korban Pesach, but these other sacrifices have to come from public funds collected on a yearly basis from all the adult male Jews, half a shekel each. And that was collected every year, and that was what paid for the sacrifices. And you cannot take private donations for these things. You can't say, well, the Rothschild is rich, so not only did he pay for a large part of the temple construction, which God willing he will do, and also, God willing, the Safra family and the rest of the great donors who have built so many fine institutions on behalf of their Jewish brethren, when it comes time for them to donate toward the construction of the temple, they will not be able to donate toward the sacrifices. That has to come equally from all the Jewish men. And no one's been collecting this money. If we wanted to do the Korban Tamid tomorrow morning, we need the proper authorities to go and collect half a shekel from all the Jewish men, or to pay for the lambs for example, the 2 lambs tomorrow and the 4 lambs that need to be offered this Saturday, this Shabbos. That has to be done from public funds. And until we do that, until we have someone who's collecting them properly, we cannot do this, even if we would have millions of dollars in donations. So these and other issues need to be resolved very soon. So as for the propriety of offering the Korban Pesach, in our current state, it doesn't look good, but it's within our hands to improve. But not only that, I believe it's something that's critical. Why? Because we look in this week's Parashath, the sages said that there were 2 mitzvahs that we are given, in whose merit the performance allowed the Israelites to leave Egypt, and that was circumcision and Korban Pesach. Many are familiar with the fact that in this week's Parashath, the mitzvahs begin. This is the beginning of when Moses started handing down the commandments. And the first commandment he gave to the people, they have to set a calendar. It was not in the merit of that mitzvah, even though it's an awesome mitzvah, figuring out when the new moon will come out and making a blessing thereon and establishing the calendar. I have a little bit to say about that, as many of you know. That is important, but that's not what got us out of Egypt. And all the other mitzvahs there that followed weren't. As a matter of fact, the mitzvah to keep the holy day of Passover, the fact that it's a day like the Sabbath in which you're not allowed to do forbidden work, precedes the mitzvah to keep the Sabbath itself. Very interesting. It's a type of Sabbath, but we got Passover first. So it was these commandments that allowed us to leave Egypt. Really, it turns out that after the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Israelites are supposed to head on a 3-day journey to the land of Israel and enter it. But 40 days afterwards, when Moses came down from the mountain, he had found the whole thing with the golden calf. And they sort of got stuck there another 82 days until Yom Kippur. And then God gave them the instructions, build a tabernacle. Now they have to understand, this is apparently a major detour in time. It was a major delay. And then before they started going, once again, they were going to travel in ER. They had to wait for springtime to start heading toward the Holy Land. Once again, they began that year with the offering of the Korban Pesach. That was the only time they did it, the entire time they were in the desert. Even the Nisan before they actually crossed the Jordan River, a year before, they did not do Korban Pesach. That wasn't because they weren't going to be entering the land that year. It says in the book of Joshua that the next time they offered Korban Pesach, the third one in history, was when they finally crossed the Jordan, before they even began conquering the land, driving out the inhabitants, dividing land among the tribes, and settling in. The Jewish people offered the Korban Pesach. And again, different stages in history, the Korban Pesach is associated with major revolutions and major movements of repentance. And ultimately, the Korban Pesach is described as the main action that was undertaken by the returnees from the exile before they built the second temple. It seems very clear that, on the contrary, it's not that we wait for the redemption, we'll wait for the Messiah, we'll wait for the building of the temple before we could offer Korban Pesach. It's that Korban Pesach will allow us to be redeemed. Korban Pesach will allow us the merits necessary to rebuild the temple. Korban Pesach has to come first. And that is evident apparently from the words of the prophets, the words of the Torah, and why this mitzvah was so important. God didn't tell Moses, go to the people of Israel and tell them to start keeping Rosh Chodesh and Shabbos and start circumcising. Well, he did tell them to circumcise themselves in order to do the Korban Pesach. It was only to do that. What they had to do in order to leave Egypt was do that Korban Pesach, get that organized. And that is it. And that's what we're trying to do. I hope that, God willing, this week people internalize this lesson. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Send in your questions and comments. Look for the Haggadah Pesach online and in your nearest book dealers, bookstores. If they don't carry it, ask them why they're not carrying it, because don't forget, everybody needs a copy this coming Passover. this year and every year, God willing. We'll see you in Jerusalem.